Most people walk through their lives believing the relationships they ended up with were a matter of luck. Good luck with the ones who stayed, bad luck with the ones who hurt them. Carl Jung looked at this same pattern for 40 years and concluded something else entirely. The people who arrive in your life aren't arriving randomly. They're being summoned, quietly, unconsciously, through frequencies you've been broadcasting since childhood. Frequencies you don't even know you're sending. And until you understand what you're actually transmitting, you'll keep being puzzled by who keeps showing up. Jung came to this conclusion slowly. He was a psychiatrist, and he resisted anything that smelled like magical thinking. But after decades of sitting with patients who kept ending up in the same configurations, the same kinds of partners, the same kinds of friends, the same kinds of betrayals dressed in different faces, he had to admit that something was happening beneath the surface of conscious choice. Something was pulling people toward each other with a precision that couldn't be explained by accident. He developed an idea he called synchronicity, which most people misunderstand as meaningful coincidence. That's the watered-down version. What Jung was actually describing was a kind of correspondence between the inner world of a person and the outer events that surrounded them. The psyche, in his observation, doesn't just react to what arrives. It draws what arrives. The unconscious works like a magnet, and what it pulls toward itself is anything but random. Today, I want to walk you through what Jung actually discovered about this hidden mechanism, why certain people show up in your life again and again wearing different faces, what your nervous system is broadcasting that you can't hear, where the original signal was set, and what it would actually take to start sending a different one. Let's start with what you can actually observe. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, can identify a pattern in the relationships that have caused them the most pain. The partners weren't the same person, but they shared something. A way of withdrawing when intimacy got too close. A way of needing you to be smaller than you were. A way of going cold without warning. The faces changed. The dynamic didn't. You probably noticed this at some point and tried to understand it. Maybe you read a book about attachment styles and recognized yourself in one of the descriptions. Maybe a therapist pointed out that you keep choosing variations on the same theme. There's truth in those frameworks. They describe the pattern accurately, but they don't always answer the deeper question, which is why the pattern has such a long reach. Because the pattern doesn't stop with romantic partners. If you look carefully, the same frequency shows up in your friendships, in your bosses, in the strangers who somehow manage to wound you in exactly the place you're already bruised. The world keeps handing you the same lesson, dressed in different costumes, and you keep being confused about why it found you again. Jung's answer was that the world isn't handing you anything. You're calling it. There's a signal you've been sending, through your body language, through the choices you make, through the people you tolerate and the people you push away, through 1,000 micro-decisions you make every day without noticing. And that signal is being received by anyone whose own signal matches it. The match happens before you ever have a conscious thought about it. By the time you're noticing someone, the recognition has already occurred at a level beneath language. Think of it like a tuning fork. If you strike a tuning fork in a room full of other tuning forks, only the ones tuned to the same frequency will start vibrating in response. The others sit completely silent, unmoved, as if the sound didn't happen at all. They're simply not calibrated to receive what's being sent. This is what Jung was describing when he talked about the unconscious recognizing itself in others. You aren't drawn to people for the reasons you think you're drawn to them. You're drawn to people whose internal frequency answers something in your own. And the more deeply buried that frequency is, the less aware you are of what you're actually transmitting, the more inevitable the attraction feels when it happens. Here's where Jung went deeper than almost any of his contemporaries. He recognized that what we call chemistry, or connection, is rarely a response to who someone actually is. It's a response to who they remind us of, structurally, at the level of the nervous system. Not necessarily a specific person from your past, though sometimes it's that too. More often it's a configuration, a pattern of emotional availability and withdrawal, a particular quality of presence or absence, a specific way of being seen or unseen. If you grew up with a parent whose love was conditional on your performance, your nervous system learned what conditional love feels like. It learned the specific rhythm of reaching and being denied, of trying harder when warmth got withdrawn, of organizing your entire emotional life around someone else's approval. That rhythm became familiar, and familiar, to the unconscious, often registers as home, even when home was a place that hurt you. So, decades later, when you meet someone who has that same rhythm, your body recognizes it before your mind does. You feel a pull. You call it chemistry. You can't explain why this person, out of all the people in the room, is the one who lit something up in you. Jung would tell you that the lighting up isn't mysterious at all. It's a tuning fork responding to its frequency. Your unconscious has found someone who can play the song it already knows. Here's the part most people miss. The song the unconscious knows isn't always a love song. Often it's a wound song, the specific melody of how you were hurt as a child, played in a key your body has been listening for ever since. When someone arrives who can hit those notes, you don't experience them as dangerous. You experience them as deeply, almost cosmically familiar. The familiarity feels like destiny. This is why people sometimes describe their most painful relationships using language usually reserved for spiritual experiences. I felt like I'd known them forever. It was like coming home. No one has ever seen me like this. Those statements are true at a certain level. The recognition is real. But what's being recognized often isn't the person standing in front of you. It's the dynamic, the shape of the wound, the configuration your nervous system has been organized around since before you had words for it. Jung understood this with a clarity that made his work difficult for people to swallow at the time. He was suggesting that the love we feel might sometimes be the love of returning to something familiar rather than the love of finding something new. And that until we recognize what's actually being recognized, we'll keep mistaking repetition for fate. Picture someone, a composite of every woman who ever walked into a consulting room confused about why this kept happening. She's 38. She's intelligent, self-aware, has done years of work on herself. She can describe her attachment style fluently. She knows about emotionally unavailable men. She's read everything. And she just ended another relationship that followed the exact pattern she's been trying to break for 15 years. She tells the story, and somewhere in the telling she says something that gives the whole thing away. She says, "I knew within an hour of meeting him that something was wrong. There was this feeling I get sometimes, like a flicker, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was projecting old stuff onto him, so I stayed." The flicker she felt was the recognition. Her unconscious had identified the frequency in the first hour. Her conscious mind, having read all those books, overrode the warning because it had been taught that warnings like that were usually just trauma talking. So she pursued the connection. 18 months later, she was sitting on the floor of her apartment at 3 in the morning, watching the relationship end in exactly the way her body had predicted on the day she met him. The flicker is the data. The pull is the warning. Jung would have told her, would have told all of us, that the body knows what the mind hasn't yet been allowed to say. The instant attraction that feels like fate is often the body identifying a familiar wound rather than the soul recognizing a familiar friend. Learning to tell the difference is one of the central tasks of adult life. To shift any of this, you have to understand where the original tuning happened. Jung was relentless about this. You can't change what you don't first see. And the signal you've been broadcasting was set during a period of your life when you had no choice in the matter. You arrived as a small, dependent creature in a world you didn't design, with caregivers whose own wounds shaped how they could and couldn't respond to you. You adapted to what was there. If warmth was conditional, you learned to perform for it. If attention was scarce, you learned to take whatever crumbs were offered and call yourself full. If love was tangled up with anger or unpredictability, you learned to read micro shifts in the emotional weather of a room before you could read words. These adaptations weren't choices. They were survival strategies, encoded into your nervous system before you had the cognitive capacity to question them, and they kept you alive. The problem is that they also tuned your frequency. The strategies you developed to survive that particular emotional environment became the signal you've been broadcasting ever since. And the universe, meaning in this case the actual people you encounter, keep sending back exactly what you're transmitting, not as punishment, as physics. Jung saw this pattern so consistently that he came to believe most adult suffering was, at its root, a kind of resonance problem. People weren't suffering because life had treated them randomly. They were suffering because they were still calling out at a frequency tuned by people who hadn't been able to love them properly. And every relationship that answered that call was confirming the original tuning rather than challenging it. The cruelest part isn't that this happens, it's that it feels right when it does. The familiar wound doesn't announce itself as a wound, it announces itself as recognition. And so people spend decades chasing the feeling of recognition without realizing that what they're recognizing is the exact shape of the thing that hurt them in the first place. This is the part of the work that's hard to do alone. The frequency you're trying to identify is the one you've been broadcasting your entire life. It's the water you're swimming in, the instrument you're listening with. You can't easily hear a signal you've been emitting since before you could speak. If anything in this is starting to feel uncomfortably familiar, if you're starting to recognize the patterns I'm describing in your own relationships, your own choices, your own way of being drawn to people who confirm what you already half suspect about yourself, there's a resource that was built for exactly this kind of moment. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's framework, designed to help you start hearing the frequency you've been broadcasting. The link is below. It's a way to begin the work of retuning, slowly, in your own time. And now let's keep going, because the next part is where this whole picture starts to shift. Here's what Jung saw happen when someone actually began to do this work. The first thing to change wasn't who they were attracting. It was their relationship to the pull itself. The chemistry that used to feel like destiny started feeling more like information. The instant recognition still happened, but instead of charging forward into it, the person started pausing, asking what was actually being recognized, wondering, with real curiosity, what their body was responding to before their mind had time to romanticize it. This pause is the first crack in the old pattern. It doesn't feel transformational at the time. It feels small, almost analytical, like you're overthinking something you used to just let happen. What's actually occurring is that you've inserted consciousness into a process that was previously automatic. The tuning fork still responds. You just notice it responding. And the noticing changes what happens next. For a long time, this is the only thing that changes. The same kinds of people still arrive. The pull still happens. But your capacity to act on the pull starts weakening, because each time you act, you bring more awareness to what you're actually choosing. You start noticing, mid-conversation, that you're already performing for someone's approval. You notice yourself adjusting your tone to soften something they said. You notice that the warmth you're feeling is contingent on you being smaller than you are. These noticings are uncomfortable because they reveal something the old self didn't want to know, that you were participating in dynamics that hurt you. The wound wasn't just being done to you, you were also, on some level, signaling for it. Jung was unflinching about this. He believed that until people could see their own contribution to the patterns they were caught in, they couldn't change them. And seeing it isn't about blame. It's about recovering the agency that the old narrative obscured. Here's where the frequency starts to shift, through accumulated micro-refusals. You decline the dynamic that used to feel inevitable. You sit with the loneliness of letting a chemistry go that your body says you should grab. Each refusal, however small, rewrites the signal you're broadcasting. The tuning fork is being retuned by your willingness to stop responding to the old note. This process is slower than most people want it to be. It doesn't happen in a weekend retreat or after a single breakthrough conversation in therapy. Jung described individuation, his term for the long work of becoming who you actually are, as a project that occupies the second half of a person's life. He spoke of it that way because he wanted to be honest about what genuine change requires. The frequency was set over decades. Shifting it takes years of conscious participation. But here's what Jung saw happen for the people who stayed with the work. At some point, usually quietly with no fanfare, the kinds of people showing up in their life started to be different. The same magnetic pull happened, but it was pulling them towards something else, toward people whose presence didn't require them to shrink, toward connections that didn't run on the old wound currency, toward warmth that came without the price tag of self-erasure attached. The world hadn't changed, the signal had. And the signal had changed because the inner organization that produced it had been slowly, patiently, painfully rearranged. Jung described the people who completed this kind of inner work as having a different quality of presence. They could enter a room and not be hijacked by every available dynamic. They could meet someone fascinating and remain free to walk away. They could notice the flicker, the body's old recognition, without confusing it for fate. And because their nervous system was finally broadcasting something different, the people their unconscious called toward them were finally different too. This is the part the original idea keeps coming back to. The people in your life are not strangers who happen to find you. They're answers to a question you've been asking without knowing you were asking it. Some of them are answers to old questions, questions your wounded self has been broadcasting since childhood. Some of them, eventually, are answers to new questions. Questions you're only able to ask because you've done the work of becoming someone capable of asking them. What this means, at the most practical level, is this. The people around you right now are a mirror of something inside you right now. They aren't a verdict on your worth or a punishment for some past failing. They're information, showing you, with terrible precision, what frequency you're currently sending out into the world. And if you don't like what they're showing you, the move is to stop blaming the mirror. The mirror is doing what mirrors do. The work is to change what's standing in front of it. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, recognizing the patterns, recognizing the people, recognizing the way your body has been answering a call you didn't consciously make, there's something I want you to hold on to. You aren't broken because you've been broadcasting this signal. You're a person who survived an environment by learning what frequencies kept you safest in it. The signal you've been sending is evidence of your intelligence rather than your dysfunction. It worked, once. It kept you connected to people you needed. It earned you whatever scraps of love were available. The problem isn't the existence of the signal. The problem is that you've outgrown the conditions that made it necessary, and the signal is still going. You're broadcasting a survival strategy into a world that doesn't require it anymore. And the people answering that broadcast are the ones whose own wounds happen to match yours. They're showing up because you're still calling. And you're still calling because no one ever showed you how to stop. Learning to stop is 1,000 small acts of attention. Noticing when your body lights up at someone and asking what's actually being lit up. Sitting with the discomfort of letting a familiar connection go. Choosing the quieter, less dramatic resonance over the one that feels like fireworks. Letting your nervous system experience, slowly, that connection doesn't have to be loud to be real. Jung believed this kind of attention was the closest thing to genuine inner work that a modern person could do. He saw it as serious because it required you to become conscious of what had been unconscious. And consciousness, for Jung, was the only currency that actually bought freedom. Freedom from what? From the inevitability of the pattern. From the certainty that the next person walking through the door is going to wear the same wound as the last one. From the exhausting suspicion that you're somehow cursed to live the same relationship over and over with different faces. You aren't cursed, you're tuned. And tuning can be changed. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. But it can be changed. Jung staked his entire body of work on that belief, that the unconscious was not a sealed room, but a place that could be entered, examined, and reorganized by anyone willing to do the work. And the people who do that work, the ones who keep going, even when it feels like nothing is changing, even when the same kinds of people keep arriving for years before the shift becomes visible, they eventually find themselves in a life that looks completely different from the one they used to have. The world hadn't bent for them. They had simply stopped sending out the call for the world they didn't want. So when you find yourself wondering why a certain kind of person keeps walking into your life, why the same lessons keep arriving wearing different clothes, let the wondering be a beginning rather than an accusation. There's a better question available than, what's wrong with me? Try this one instead. What am I broadcasting that I haven't yet learned to hear? That second question is workable. It opens a door instead of slamming one. Jung would have wanted you to know that the door is always there, even after decades of patterns, Even after the same configurations have arrived so many times you've started to think they're inevitable. The frequency that drew them was learned, and anything learned can, in time, be learned differently. This is the work. It's quiet. It's largely invisible to anyone watching from the outside. It doesn't produce dramatic before and after stories that look good on social media, but it produces, eventually, a life that fits. A life where the people who arrive feel like an honest answer to who you actually are, rather than an echo of what you survived. The strange, almost humbling thing about this, the thing Jung kept circling back to in his later work, is that the moment you stop calling for the old wound, the people who used to find you stop being able to find you. They're no longer receiving your signal. Your frequency has moved out of range of theirs. And in the space their absence creates, room opens for connections that the old you couldn't have heard, let alone attracted. That's the part worth holding on to. The work is still slow, still patient, still requires you to sit with discomfort that the old part of you wants to escape from. But it goes somewhere. The signal you're learning to send is being heard by something. The people calibrated to your healing are out there, waiting for you to become someone they can recognize. In the meantime, look at who's around you right now. Look without judgment. Look at the dynamics, the rhythms, the way you feel in your body when you spend time with each person in your life. That's the current frequency, reflected back. That's the work in progress. And every conscious adjustment you make to it is a vote for a different life arriving, eventually, at your door. The people in your life are not strangers. They never were. They're the echoes of who you've been, and the early signals of who you're becoming. Jung spent his career trying to convince people that this was true, that nothing about who shows up in your life is accidental, and that the moment you understand this, you stop being a victim of your relationships and start becoming the author of them. That authorship doesn't arrive overnight, but it does arrive. For anyone willing to listen to what's been calling them, and to start, slowly, calling for something else. If you've been listening to all of this and you can feel the recognition in your body, the slow, uncomfortable acknowledgement that some of the people in your life are answering a call you didn't know you were sending, then something is already shifting in you. Recognition is the first crack in the pattern. It's the moment the unconscious becomes available to be seen. And what becomes available to be seen becomes available to be changed. You're at the threshold of a different kind of attention to your own life. The relationships ahead of you don't have to look like the ones behind you. The frequency can be retuned, and the people waiting on the other side of that retuning are the ones you've been quietly, painfully, hoping for without knowing they were possible. If you want to walk into that work with something to support you, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for moments like this one. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's framework, designed to help you start hearing the signal you've been sending and slowly, with care, learning to send something else. The link is right below this video.